I never thought that a single word would cost me my entire family. That one syllable, two letters, spoken quietly in my mother's living room on a Sunday afternoon in March, would unleash a war I never saw coming. But when I said no, I meant it. And they made me pay for it in ways I'm still processing to this day. My name is Sarah, and I need to tell you what happened when I finally stopped being the person my family expected me to be. I need to tell you about the lies they told, the secrets they kept, and the lengths they went to destroy me simply because I refused to sacrifice myself one more time. But more than anything, I need to tell you how I fought back, how I discovered the truth about the people I'd trusted my entire life, and how, in the end, the consequences of their actions caught up with them in ways none of us could have predicted. This story starts with my grandmother, Eleanor. She was the only person in my family who ever truly saw me. While my mother doted on my older brother Daniel, praising his every mediocre achievement and excusing his endless failures, my grandmother noticed me. She saw the little girl reading alone in the corner at family gatherings. She saw the teenager working 2 jobs to save for college, while Daniel crashed the car my parents bought him for his 16th birthday. She saw the young woman building a career in financial consulting, while my brother drifted from one failed venture to another, always with my parents' checkbook to cushion his fall. Eleanor and I would spend hours together at her cottage in the countryside, about 40 miles outside of the city where I grew up. It was a beautiful property, modest but charming, with a wraparound porch and gardens she tended with meticulous care. The house had been in our family for 3 generations, passed down through the women of our family. My grandmother inherited it from her mother, and her mother before that. It was more than just a house. It was history. It was legacy. It was the one place where I felt truly at peace. When my grandmother passed away 2 years ago, I was devastated in a way that I still can't fully articulate. She was 87 and had lived a full life, but losing her felt like losing the only anchor I had to feeling valued in my family. I flew home for the funeral, took a week off work, and threw myself into helping organize the service, the reception. Everything my mother claimed was too overwhelming for her to handle. Daniel and his wife Rebecca showed up the day before the funeral, stayed for exactly 3 days, and left the morning after, citing work obligations that I later learned were completely fabricated. It was 3 weeks after the funeral when my grandmother's attorney contacted me. His name was Harold Chen, and he asked if I could come to his office to discuss my grandmother's estate. I assumed I was being called in as a family representative, maybe to help organize paperwork or act as a witness. I had no idea that my grandmother had made specific arrangements that would change everything. I'll never forget sitting in that leather chair across from Harold's desk, watching him slide a document toward me with a gentle, knowing expression. Eleanor had left the cottage to me. Only to me. The property, the land, everything in it. She had written a letter to accompany the will, which Harold handed me in a sealed envelope with my name written in her elegant cursive. My hands trembled as I opened it. The letter was 3 pages long, and I won't share all of it because some things are too sacred, too private. But there were certain passages that I've read so many times I could recite them from memory. She wrote that she had watched me be overlooked and undervalued for my entire life. She wrote that she saw how hard I worked while others took shortcuts. She wrote that she wanted me to have a place that was mine, truly mine, where no one could make me feel less than I was. She ended the letter by saying that she trusted me to honor the legacy of that home, but more importantly, she trusted me to finally honor myself. I cried in Harold's office for 20 minutes. He was patient, kind, handing me tissues and giving me the space to process what my grandmother had done. When I finally composed myself, he explained the details. The cottage was valued at approximately $400,000, considering the property, the land, and its location in an area that had become increasingly desirable over the years. There was also a small amount of cash, about $15,000, which she had left to me separately. My mother had been left some jewelry and personal effects. Daniel had been left my grandfather's watch and a set of vintage tools. Everything else, Eleanor's primary asset, had been designated for me. Harold warned me that this decision might cause friction within my family. He had known Eleanor for 20 years and understood the dynamics she had observed and clearly wanted to address with this inheritance. He advised me to be prepared for difficult conversations. I thanked him, signed the necessary paperwork, and drove home in a daze of grief and gratitude and growing unease. I decided to tell my mother in person. I drove to her house that weekend, the same house I grew up in, the house where I learned to make myself small so that Daniel could take up all the space. She was in the kitchen when I arrived, and she greeted me with her usual distracted air, asking about the weather and whether I wanted tea, never quite meeting my eyes. I told her about the inheritance as gently as I could. I explained that grandmother had left me the cottage, that there was a letter expressing her wishes, and that I planned to honor those wishes by keeping the property. I said I understood this might be surprising, and that I was open to discussing it if she had questions. The silence that followed was one of the most uncomfortable moments of my life. My mother stood at the counter, her back to me, her hands frozen on the teapot. When she finally turned around, her expression was unlike anything I had ever seen. It was cold, calculating, furious in a way that felt barely contained. She asked me to repeat what I had just said. I did. She asked if I was joking. I said I was not. She asked how I could possibly think this was fair. I said I didn't make the decision, grandmother did. And that's when the mask slipped completely. My mother said that Eleanor had clearly been confused in her final years. She said that the cottage should have been left to her, the eldest daughter, or divided equally among all the grandchildren. She said that Daniel had a family to support, bills to pay, that he needed that money far more than I did. She said I was selfish for even considering keeping it. She said I had obviously manipulated my grandmother somehow, taken advantage of an old woman's declining mental state. I sat there, absorbing accusations I never expected from my own mother. I tried to stay calm. I reminded her that grandmother's attorney had confirmed she was of sound mind when the will was drafted. I told her about the letter, about the specific and thoughtful reasons grandmother had provided. I said I was sorry this was difficult, but I was not going to apologize for accepting something that was given to me freely and intentionally. My mother's response was to call Daniel. Right there, in front of me, she picked up the phone and called my brother, putting him on speaker. She told him what I had just revealed, and his reaction was even worse than hers. Daniel demanded to know why I thought I deserved the cottage more than him. He called me names I won't repeat. He said grandmother had always babied me, that I had always been the favorite even though I did nothing to earn it. He said the fair thing to do was sell the property and split the proceeds 3 ways, between me, him, and our mother. When I said no, that I intended to keep the house as grandmother wished, he told me I was dead to him. Those were his exact words, dead to him, over a house, over money, over my refusal to hand over something that had been specifically and deliberately left to me. That was the first time I said no. It wouldn't be the last. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in family dysfunction. My mother called me daily, each conversation more heated than the last. She cycled through every tactic imaginable. First came the guilt, reminding me of everything she had sacrificed as a mother, of the childhood I apparently didn't appreciate, of the meals she cooked and the laundry she washed as if basic parenting entitled her to my inheritance. When guilt didn't work, she moved to threats. She said she would contest the will. She said she would tell the whole family I had stolen from my own grandmother. She said she would make sure everyone knew what kind of person I really was. When the threats didn't move me, she employed Daniel and Rebecca as reinforcements. My brother would call at odd hours, sometimes sounding pleading and desperate, other times aggressive and intimidating. He painted pictures of financial ruin, of his children going without, of his marriage falling apart because of the stress. He conveniently left out the fact that his financial troubles were entirely self-inflicted, the result of years of reckless spending and failed business ventures that my parents had repeatedly bailed him out of. He also failed to mention that Rebecca came from money, that her parents were wealthy, that they lived in a 5-bedroom house in an upscale neighborhood. The idea that they needed my grandmother's cottage to survive was absurd. Rebecca was more subtle in her approach. She reached out to me directly, woman to woman, pretending to understand my position. She said she knew how difficult family could be. She said she respected my grandmother's wishes. But then she pivoted, suggesting that maybe there was a compromise to be found. Perhaps I could let them use the cottage as a vacation home. Perhaps I could rent it to them at below market rate. Perhaps I could just sign it over to them now and avoid all this unpleasantness, and they would surely repay me somehow, someday, when they were back on their feet. Each suggestion was another version of the same request. Give up what's yours. Sacrifice for Daniel, the way you've always been expected to. Put yourself last so he can come first. And each time I said no. I began documenting everything. Every phone call. I made notes afterward detailing what was said. Every text message and email I saved in multiple locations. Something in my gut told me I would need this record, that the situation was escalating in ways I couldn't fully predict. I was right. The first major attack came about 6 weeks after the reading of the will. I received a call from a former colleague, someone I had worked with years ago but hadn't spoken to recently. She sounded uncomfortable, apologetic. She said she had received a strange message and felt I should know about it. Someone had been contacting people in our professional network, telling them I had committed financial fraud at my previous company. The accusations were specific enough to sound credible, but vague enough to be impossible to definitively disprove. The source of these messages was anonymous, but my former colleague said the writing style reminded her of something. She forwarded me one of the messages. I recognized the phrasing immediately. It was Rebecca. The way she structured sentences, the vocabulary she used, the particular rhythm of her accusations. I had received enough texts and emails from her over the years to know her voice on the page. She was trying to destroy my professional reputation. I felt sick, not just angry, though I was certainly that, but physically ill at the realization that my own family was willing to torpedo my career, my livelihood, my entire future, because I wouldn't give them a house. This wasn't about the cottage anymore. This was punishment. This was war. I took the evidence to a lawyer, not Harold, who specialized in estate planning, but a litigation attorney recommended by a friend. Her name was Monica, and she was exactly the kind of person I needed in that moment. Sharp, pragmatic, and utterly unintimidated by the wealthy and entitled. I showed her everything I had collected, the harassing messages from my mother and brother, the anonymous professional sabotage from Rebecca, the timeline of escalation. She listened carefully, asked pointed questions, and then gave me advice that would shape everything that followed. Monica told me that I had grounds for a cease and desist order, potentially even a harassment case if the behavior continued. But she also warned me that legal action against family was a bell that couldn't be unrung. Once I took that step, there would be no going back, no reconciliation, no pretending things could ever be normal again. I told her I understood. I told her that normal had never really existed in my family anyway, that I had just been too conditioned to see it. We drafted a formal cease and desist letter addressed to my mother, Daniel, and Rebecca. It outlined their behavior in clinical, legal terms. It demanded they stop all contact that could be construed as harassment or defamation. It warned of legal consequences if they failed to comply. Monica sent it by certified mail so we could confirm receipt. The response was immediate and predictable. My mother called me screaming, saying I had humiliated her by involving lawyers. Daniel left a voicemail calling me every name he could think of. Rebecca, notably, went silent. She was smart enough to know when to back off, at least temporarily. But the damage to my professional reputation had already begun. Over the following weeks, I learned that the anonymous messages had reached more people than I initially realized. A prospective client backed out of a contract at the last minute, citing concerns they wouldn't elaborate on. A speaking engagement I had been confirmed for was quietly canceled. My LinkedIn began receiving connection requests from people I suspected were either fake profiles or individuals trying to gather information about me. The Whisper campaign was working. I threw myself into damage control. I reached out to trusted colleagues and explained the situation without going into family details. I framed it as a personal matter that had spilled into my professional life, assuring them there was no truth to any accusations and that I was addressing it legally. Most people were sympathetic. Some were skeptical. A few distanced themselves entirely, and I couldn't blame them. In business, reputation is everything, and even the appearance of impropriety can be fatal. During this period, I received an unexpected phone call. It was my Aunt Patricia, my mother's younger sister. Patricia had been estranged from our family for as long as I could remember. The story I had been told growing up was that she was difficult, jealous, and had cut herself off after some unspecified falling out decades ago. I had only met her a handful of times, mostly at larger family gatherings where she was treated with polite coldness by everyone else. Patricia said she had heard what was happening. She didn't say how, but I later learned that she still had contacts in the family, people who kept her informed out of their own sense of duty, or perhaps guilt. She said she wasn't surprised by any of it. And then she said something that stopped me cold. She said my mother had done the same thing to her 30 years ago. Patricia asked if we could meet. She said there were things I needed to know, things that might help me understand what I was dealing with. I agreed without hesitation. We met at a quiet restaurant midway between our cities, and over the course of 3 hours, my entire understanding of my family history was demolished and rebuilt. Patricia told me that she and my mother had inherited money from their own parents when they passed. It was supposed to be split equally, as their parents had intended. But my mother, the older sibling, had manipulated the situation. She convinced their father, in his final confused months, to change the will. She made Patricia out to be irresponsible, untrustworthy, not deserving of her share. By the time their father died, the inheritance had been restructured to heavily favor my mother. Patricia tried to contest it, but she didn't have the resources to fight a prolonged legal battle. She was in her late 20s, working as a public defender, while my mother had married well and had access to expensive attorneys. The estrangement that followed was painted as Patricia's choice, as her being difficult and bitter. But the truth was that my mother had pushed her out, had isolated her from the family, had controlled the narrative so completely that everyone believed her version without question. For 30 years, Patricia had lived with being the family villain when she was actually the victim. I sat there, absorbing this revelation, feeling like I was seeing my family for the first time. The patterns were identical. The golden child, in my mother's generation, had been my mother herself. The overlooked sibling was Patricia. And now, a generation later, the same dynamic was playing out between me and Daniel. My grandmother Eleanor had seen it. That's why she left me the cottage. She was trying to break the cycle. She was trying to give me what she couldn't give her younger daughter. Patricia had more to tell me. She said that over the years she had kept records of her own, documents and letters and evidence of what my mother had done. She had done so partly out of self-protection, partly out of a lingering hope that someday the truth would matter. She offered to share these records with me if they could help. I accepted gratefully, and over the following weeks, Patricia sent me boxes of materials, carefully organized and labeled. What I found in those boxes would become the foundation of everything that followed. There were letters between my mother and the attorney who had handled my grandparents' estate, letters that revealed deliberate manipulation of an elderly man's wishes. There were financial records showing how my mother had accessed accounts she shouldn't have had access to. There were witnesses, friends of Patricia's who had been present during key conversations, and who could testify to what they had heard. And most damning of all, there were recordings. Patricia had recorded several phone calls with my mother during the period when the inheritance dispute was happening. Calls where my mother openly admitted to what she had done, laughing about how easy it was to convince their father that Patricia was unfit. These recordings were 30 years old, but they were clear. They were undeniable. They painted a portrait of my mother that was utterly at odds with the community figurehead she had spent decades presenting to the world. Armed with this information, I began to plan. Not impulsively, not emotionally, but carefully and strategically. Monica, my attorney, helped me understand the legal implications of what I had discovered. Some of it was too old to prosecute, the statute of limitations long expired. But the records established a pattern of behavior, a documented history of manipulation and deceit that would be relevant if my current situation escalated further. And it did escalate. It escalated in ways I never expected. About 3 months after the initial confrontation, I received a letter from an attorney representing my mother. The letter stated that she intended to contest my grandmother's will on the grounds of undue influence and lack of testamentary capacity. The legal language was dense, but the message was clear. My mother was claiming that I had somehow manipulated my grandmother into leaving me the cottage, that grandmother wasn't mentally competent when she made the decision, and that therefore the inheritance should be invalidated. I knew immediately that this case had no merit. Harold Chen had been meticulous in documenting grandmother's mental state at the time the will was drafted. There were medical records, witness statements, multiple points of evidence confirming that Eleanor knew exactly what she was doing. But I also knew that the legal process would be expensive, time-consuming, and emotionally draining. My mother was counting on that. She was counting on wearing me down, on making the cost of keeping the cottage so high that I would simply give in. What she didn't know was that I had been preparing for exactly this possibility. Monica and I had assembled a counter-strategy that went far beyond simple defense. We had the evidence from Patricia, evidence that demonstrated a pattern of inheritance manipulation spanning decades. We had documentation of the harassment campaign against me. We had the defamatory messages that Rebecca had sent. And we had something else, something that emerged from my own investigation into my brother's finances. I mentioned earlier that I work in financial consulting. It's a field that requires attention to detail, the ability to trace money, and a deep understanding of how people hide their true financial situations. When Daniel first claimed to be in desperate straits, something didn't add up. He and Rebecca lived in an expensive house, drove luxury cars, sent their children to private schools. The image they projected didn't match the poverty they claimed. I started digging. I used public records, property databases, corporate filings, everything that was legally accessible. What I found was stunning. Daniel had been running a series of shell companies for years, businesses that existed primarily on paper. He had been using these entities to hide income, to shield assets, and most importantly, to fraudulently claim financial hardship in other contexts. He had defaulted on loans by claiming he had no money, while secretly funneling funds through these companies to maintain his lifestyle. It was fraud. Not the vague, unsubstantiated kind that Rebecca had accused me of, but actual, documented, provable fraud. I took this information to Monica. She connected me with a forensic accountant who confirmed my findings and helped me compile them into a coherent picture. We didn't go to the authorities immediately. Instead, we waited. We added this evidence to our file and continued building our case. The court date for my mother's will contest approached. I dreaded it and anticipated it in equal measure. The night before, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake thinking about everything that had led to this moment, every time I had been overlooked, every sacrifice I had made for a family that saw me as nothing more than a resource to be exploited. I thought about my grandmother, about her letter, about her wish that I would finally honor myself. I decided that whatever happened tomorrow, I would not back down. I would not apologize for claiming what was rightfully mine. I would not let them win. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, more intimate. My mother arrived with Daniel and Rebecca, all three of them dressed impeccably, presenting the image of a respectable family forced into this unfortunate situation by an ungrateful daughter. Their attorney was expensive, polished, the kind of lawyer who specialized in making the wrong side look sympathetic. But our side had facts. Monica was brilliant. She dismantled their case piece by piece, presenting Harold Chen's documentation of grandmother's mental competence, the multiple witnesses who had interacted with Eleanor in her final years, and could testify to her clarity, the letter grandmother had written explaining her decision in her own words. The judge reviewed the evidence carefully, asking pointed questions that revealed his skepticism toward my mother's claims. Then, Monica dropped the first bomb. She introduced the evidence of the harassment campaign, the documented escalation of attacks against me, the defamatory messages sent to damage my career. She framed the will contest not as a legitimate legal challenge, but as the latest tactic in an ongoing effort to bully me into submission. She showed the pattern, the timeline, the correlation between my refusals and their attacks. My mother's attorney objected repeatedly, arguing that this was irrelevant to the question of the will's validity. The judge overruled most of the objections, noting that patterns of behavior were relevant to assessing the credibility and motivations of the parties involved. Then came the second bomb. Monica introduced the evidence from Patricia, the 30-year-old documentation of how my mother had manipulated her own parents' estate. She called Patricia as a witness, and my aunt took the stand with a calm dignity that I will never forget. She testified to what had happened to her, to the tactics my mother had used, to the lies that had been told. She played the recordings of those phone calls from 3 decades ago, my mother's voice filling the courtroom with her casual admissions of manipulation and deceit. My mother's face went white. Daniel looked confused, as if he couldn't process what he was hearing. Rebecca's expression hardened into something dangerous, calculating. Their attorney called for a recess, and the judge granted it. During the break, I walked outside to get air. I was shaking, not from fear, but from the release of decades of suppressed truth finally coming to light. Patricia found me there and took my hand. She said she was proud of me. She said grandmother would have been proud too. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I might actually be okay. When we returned to the courtroom, my mother's attorney requested to approach the bench. There was a quiet conference between the attorneys and the judge that I couldn't hear. Then the judge announced that the plaintiff was withdrawing the will contest. My mother was dropping the case. I had won. But the victory felt hollow in some ways, because I knew it wasn't really over. My mother had retreated, but she hadn't surrendered. The look she gave me as she left the courtroom told me everything. This wasn't the end. It was just the end of that particular battle. What I did next is something I've questioned many times since. I debated it for weeks, consulting with Monica, with Patricia, with my own conscience. But ultimately, I decided that letting them get away with everything would only empower them to do it again, to me or to someone else. The cycle had to break. The consequences had to be real. I took the evidence of Daniel's financial fraud to the appropriate authorities. I filed a detailed report with the supporting documentation, the shell companies, the hidden income, the fraudulent claims of hardship. I did it anonymously at first, not because I was ashamed, but because I wanted the investigation to proceed on its own merits, without being dismissed as a family vendetta. The investigation took months. During that time, the silence from my family was almost more unnerving than the attacks had been. My mother stopped calling. Daniel's number was disconnected. Rebecca blocked me on every platform. I existed in a strange limbo, waiting for the other shoe to drop while simultaneously rebuilding my life piece by piece. I moved into my grandmother's cottage. It needed work, repairs that had been deferred in her final years, updates to make it fully livable. I threw myself into the renovation, finding peace in the physical labor of restoring something beautiful. I painted the walls the soft blue that grandmother had always talked about but never gotten around to. I replanted her garden with the flowers she had loved. I hung her photographs in the hallway and felt her presence with me every day. Patricia became a regular visitor. We had lost 30 years of relationship to my mother's lies, and we were determined to make up for lost time. She told me stories about grandmother, about my grandfather, about the family history that had been hidden from me. She showed me photographs I had never seen, letters I had never read. Through her, I came to understand that I was part of a lineage of women who had survived difficult circumstances, who had fought for their dignity, who had refused to be diminished by those who sought to control them. 6 months after I filed the fraud report, I received a call from an investigator. He told me that charges were being filed against Daniel and Rebecca. The investigation had uncovered even more than I had found, a web of financial crimes that extended back years. They were being charged with multiple counts of fraud, tax evasion, and money laundering. The case was serious. They were facing potential prison time. I felt a complicated mix of emotions. There was satisfaction, certainly, that their actions were finally catching up to them. But there was also sadness, a grief for the relationship I had always hoped to have with my brother, the relationship that had never really existed, except in my wishful imagination. I had loved Daniel once, or at least I had loved the idea of him, the brother I wanted him to be, rather than the person he actually was. The news of their arrest spread quickly. Our small community where we grew up buzzed with speculation and scandal. My mother's carefully cultivated image as a respectable community leader began to crumble. People who had admired her for years started questioning what else they might have missed, what other deceptions might be hidden beneath her polished surface. The whisper network that she had used against me now turned in the opposite direction. I didn't participate in the gossip, I didn't gloat or celebrate publicly, but I also didn't hide. When people asked me about the situation, I told them the truth, simply and without embellishment. Yes, my brother had been arrested. Yes, there had been a will contest. No, I would not be commenting on the legal proceedings. The facts spoke for themselves. Rebecca's parents, the wealthy in-laws who had always looked down on our family as beneath them, were mortified by the scandal. They hired the best attorneys money could buy to defend their daughter, but the evidence was overwhelming. The shell companies had been traced. The money had been followed. The pattern of fraud was undeniable. The trial happened the following spring. I attended every day, sitting in the back of the courtroom, watching as the case against my brother and his wife was laid out in damning detail. The prosecutors were thorough. The witnesses were credible. The documentary evidence was extensive. Daniel tried to blame everything on Rebecca, claiming she had controlled the finances without his knowledge. Rebecca countered by implicating him fully, saying he was the mastermind who had directed every fraudulent transaction. They turned on each other with a viciousness that surprised no one who truly knew them. The jury deliberated for less than a day. Guilty on all counts for both defendants. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for 2 months later. During those 2 months, my mother reached out to me for the first time in over a year. She left a voicemail, her voice smaller and more frail than I had ever heard it. She said she knew I wouldn't answer, but she needed to say something. She said she was sorry. She said she understood if I never forgave her. She said she had been wrong about so many things for so long. She said she hoped someday I would let her explain. I listened to that voicemail several times. I analyzed every word, every pause, every inflection. Was it genuine? Was it another manipulation? I couldn't tell. And maybe that inability to trust her instincts about my own mother was the saddest part of all. I chose not to respond. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. Some bridges once burned cannot be rebuilt. Some trust, once shattered, cannot be restored. I had spent my entire life hoping my mother would see me, truly see me, and she never had. I couldn't let her back in simply because her other options had dried up. Reconciliation, if it ever happened, would have to come from a different place, from genuine remorse rather than desperate loneliness. The sentencing hearing arrived. Daniel and Rebecca stood before the judge looking diminished, their expensive clothes now looking like costumes, their confident demeanor replaced by visible fear. The judge reviewed the case, noting the extent of the fraud, the number of victims, the complete lack of remorse shown during the trial. He sentenced Daniel to 7 years in federal prison. Rebecca received 5 years. They would both be required to pay restitution that would wipe out whatever assets they had left. I watched them being led away in handcuffs. Daniel looked at me once, his expression a mixture of hatred and something else, something that might have been shame. Rebecca didn't look at anyone. She kept her eyes forward, her jaw set, refusing to acknowledge the magnitude of her fall. After the sentencing, Patricia and I went to dinner. We ordered wine and raised a toast to grandmother, to Eleanor, the woman who had seen the truth and had tried, in her own way, to set things right. I thought about her letter, about her wish that I would honor myself. I thought about everything I had been through in the past 2 years, the attacks and the accusations, and the legal battles and the emotional toll. And I realized that despite all of it, I had emerged stronger. I had claimed my voice. I had refused to be silenced. I had stood in my truth even when my entire family arrayed themselves against me. In the months that followed, I built a new life. My career recovered as the Whisper campaign faded, and people saw that the accusations against me had been baseless. I took on new clients, rebuilt my reputation, and found professional success on my own terms. The cottage became my sanctuary, a place of peace and creativity where I could finally breathe. I started writing, something I had always wanted to do but had never made time for. I wrote about family, about betrayal, about the complicated process of healing from people who were supposed to love you. Patricia and I grew closer. She became the family I had always longed for, the relative who valued me, who listened without judgment, who celebrated my successes and supported me through my struggles. We started new traditions, holiday dinners at the cottage, weekend visits, phone calls that lasted for hours. Through her, I learned that family isn't just about blood. It's about the people who show up, who choose you, who make space for you to be exactly who you are. A year after Daniel's sentencing, I received another letter from my mother. This one was longer, more detailed. She wrote about her childhood, about the insecurities and fears that had shaped her, about the choices she had made and the justifications she had told herself. She didn't ask for forgiveness, not directly, but she acknowledged for the first time that she had failed me, that she had spent my entire life favoring Daniel because he was easier to love, because he reflected her own desires back at her, because I was too independent, too questioning, too much my own person. She said she understood now that independence wasn't a flaw. It was a strength she had been too threatened to appreciate. I read that letter many times. I showed it to Patricia, who read it with tears in her eyes. She said it was more than she had ever received, more acknowledgement than she ever expected. She said maybe, just maybe, something had finally broken through. I wrote back. It took me 2 weeks to compose a response that felt honest without being cruel. I told my mother that I appreciated her letter, that I recognized the vulnerability it must have taken to write it. But I also told her that acknowledgement was only the first step. That trust had to be rebuilt through consistent action over time, that I was not ready to resume a relationship, but I was willing to leave the door open. I said that if she truly meant what she wrote, She would need to show it. Not through grand gestures or dramatic apologies, but through small, sustained choices that demonstrated she had changed. I didn't hear from her for 3 months. Then a card arrived for my birthday. Just a simple card with a short message hoping I was well and that she was thinking of me. A month later, flowers appeared on my doorstep on the anniversary of grandmother's death, with a note saying she remembered and she was sorry. These small gestures continued, sporadic but consistent, never demanding a response, but offering themselves freely. I'm still not sure what will come of it. The wounds are deep, and healing is not linear. But I've learned that holding on to anger is exhausting, that it takes more energy to maintain hatred than to simply let people exist outside your boundaries. I haven't forgiven my mother, not in the complete sense of that word. But I've released her from occupying my every thought. I've freed myself from the need for her to be different from who she is. I've accepted that I cannot change the past, only how I move forward. Daniel wrote to me from prison once. It was a short letter, full of self-pity and veiled accusations, suggesting that I had overreacted, that the punishment didn't fit the crime, that I had destroyed his family over a house. I didn't respond. Some people remain willfully blind to their own actions, and no amount of evidence will convince them otherwise. I've learned not to waste my energy trying. Rebecca never contacted me. I heard through various channels that she served her time quietly, that her parents had essentially disowned her, that her children were being raised by other relatives. There was a time when I might have felt satisfaction at this news, but now I just feel a distant sadness. Those children were innocent in all of this, casualties of their parents' choices and their grandparents' dysfunction. I hope someone is looking out for them. I hope the cycle will finally break. As I sit now on my grandmother's porch, looking out over the gardens I've restored in her memory, I think about everything that brought me here. The betrayals, the battles, the moments of despair and determination. I think about the word that started it all, that single syllable that cost me my family and ultimately gave me my freedom. No. Such a small word for such enormous power. The power to define your boundaries, the power to claim your worth, the power to refuse to be diminished by people who see you as nothing more than a means to their ends. I said no, and my family declared war on me. But in the end, I won that war. Not through aggression or cruelty, but through patience and persistence, and an unwavering commitment to the truth. My grandmother saw who I was when no one else did. She gave me this place so I would have somewhere to stand, a physical foundation for the emotional foundation she had tried to build in me throughout my life. I honor her by living here, by maintaining her gardens, by writing these words that tell the truth about what happened, and I honor myself by refusing to apologize for any of it. If you're listening to this and you're facing your own family war, I want you to know that it's possible to survive. It's possible to emerge stronger. The people who should love you the most are sometimes the ones who harm you the deepest, and walking away from that harm is not betrayal. It's survival. It's self-respect. It's the most loving thing you can do for the person you're becoming. I don't know what the future holds. I don't know if my mother and I will ever have a real relationship. I don't know what will happen when Daniel is released from prison, whether he'll seek revenge or reconciliation, or simply fade from my life entirely. I don't know if the scars will ever fully heal, or if I'll carry them forever as reminders of what I survived. But I know this. I said no, and I meant it. I stood my ground when everyone told me I was wrong. I trusted my instincts when my family told me I was crazy. I honored myself when the people who should have honored me chose instead to attack. And now I'm here, in this place that was given to me in love, living a life that I built on my own terms. The war is over, the truth has been exposed, the consequences have been delivered, and I am finally blessedly free. Some endings aren't happy in the traditional sense. There's no tearful reconciliation, no family gathering where everyone apologizes and promises to do better. But there's peace. There's clarity. There's the profound relief of no longer carrying the weight of people who only wanted to take from you. And maybe, just maybe, there's hope. Hope that the future will be different from the past. Hope that the cycle of manipulation and betrayal ends here, with me, in this cottage, on this porch, with these words. My grandmother used to say that the truth has a way of coming out, that you can bury it for years, but it eventually surfaces. She was right. The truth about my family, about my mother's pattern of deceit, about my brother's fraud, about everything they tried so hard to hide, it all came out. And in the light of that truth, their carefully constructed facades crumbled to dust. Meanwhile, I remain, standing firm, looking forward, building a life that is mine and mine alone. That's the real revenge, isn't it? Not destruction, but construction. Not tearing them down, but building myself up. Not becoming like them, but becoming more fully myself. Every day that I live well, every moment of peace I find, every success I achieve, it's a testament to everything they tried to take from me and failed. I said no. They declared war, and I won. Not because I was stronger or smarter or better than them, but because I was true. True to myself, true to my grandmother's memory, true to the simple belief that I deserve to be treated with respect and dignity. That's my story. That's what happened when I finally stopped accepting less than I was worth. That's the truth that my family tried so hard to bury, and that I've now brought fully into the light. May it find whoever needs to hear it. May it give you permission to say your own no. And may your own war, if you're fighting one, end in your victory too.